Jazz Chisholm Jr. torching guys on the field. Jazz Chisholm Jr. torching guys off the field. Boy, oh boy, Tuesday, 19th of March, and Jazz Chisholm Jr. is having a day. 2 home runs, back-to-back home runs. That's 3 home runs in the last 2 days for Jazz Chisholm Jr. Equally, he's back on Twitter, setting that ablaze, and joins the Pivot podcast, an hour and 20-minute interview that was an absolute stunner. Tons to get into. All about Jazz Chisholm Jr. This is Locked on Marlins.
You are Locked on Marlins, your daily podcast on the Miami Marlins. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings from England and welcome to Locked on Marlins. It's your daily Marlins pod. I'm your host, Peter Pratt. Of course, hit me up on X at Miami Marlins_UK. If you're listening to the pod, firstly, hello and welcome to the show. It's Tuesday, the 19th of March. Thanks for making Locked on Marlins your first listen of the day. This is your team every day, of course. Make sure you hit subscribe if you're on podcast form. Leave a review also. Reminder, there is a YouTube channel. Head on over there and hit subscribe. Also, join me on YouTube. Join me in the premiere version. Join me in the comments. A lot to talk about. There's been some topical conversations on Locked on Marlins recently. Yesterday, we were talking about it's time for Trevor Bauer. Surprise, surprise. It's probably the most commented on episode, potentially all time. All time. However, one of the most listened to and controversial episodes as well, all time, centered around that infamous players meeting back in 2022. Do you remember that one? I know you do. And it's fair to say we have a little bit more information to go off, as well as a ton more straight from the mouth of Jazz Chisholm Jr. He gives his views and thoughts on everything. And boy, oh boy, it was explosive, truly explosive. Tons to get into on this episode. This episode is sponsored by PrizePicks. It's the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnMLB and use the code, all lowercase, LockedOnMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Like I mentioned, we're starting with on-field. Jazz is absolutely, I wouldn't say he's heating up. He is heated up. He ended yesterday's game with a home run against a lefty. And that lefty was Josh Hader. We're in that spot now with Jazz. He needs to be playing every day. He wants to play every day. More about that later on. But for him to be successful and reach the levels that he wants to, he has to be able to produce at a higher level against left-handed pitching, clearly. I think the same is fair for Jesus Sanchez. A little bit about Jesus Sanchez later in this episode too. That's sprinkled into Jazz's conversation on the Pivot podcast. But for Jazz to be hitting a home run against Josh Hader, even in spring, doesn't matter. It's huge. Huge for Jazz. He followed that up then today with 2 more home runs. So effectively going 3 at-bats in a row with bombs. 3 bombs and 3 at-bats. Jazz, he is ready. And he is looking ready for action. He spoke about it. He's already said that he's put on a little bit of extra muscle this offseason. He's put I can't remember how much he said, maybe 7-8 pounds. He's added some bulk. And maybe that bulk is going to pay off for Jazz, no doubt. The other beautiful thing too is that doesn't seem to be impacting him in center field whatsoever. A splashy grab as well in center field today, as well as his 2 bombs. I think he also reached base on an error today, but then was taken out of the game. So a couple of 3 at-bats for Jazz, including 2 home runs to go with his home run yesterday against Josh Hader. Boy, oh boy, it has been a wild start, couple of days for Jazz on the field, which is, of course, extremely encouraging. And that's what we as fans need to see. No doubt about it. To be honest with you, though, today, I would say there has been more fireworks off the field. And can you imagine that? Jazz Chisholm Jr. has hit 2 home runs today. He hit one yesterday. He's had 3 home runs in 3 at-bats, and it's been more explosive off the field. That's how explosive things have been for Jazz in the last 24 hours. Boy, oh boy, it has been absolutely wild. Firstly, what I'll say is I need to welcome Jazz fully back to Twitter. It feels like he's back. It feels like his girlfriend, I think it's still his girlfriend. Anyway, she hasn't said he can't be on Twitter. So I guess when she says you can't be on, then that's when he stops. At this point, he's taken no news as good news. I think I've done the same a few times as well. Not specifically linked to Twitter, but like you sneak to the pub and have a few wines or few beers. You didn't say I couldn't. Ask for permission or ask for forgiveness later, I think is the saying, right? I don't know. Anyway, Jazz is back on Twitter, and boy, oh boy, he's been kicking up a storm. But the main storm and the main headlines that really want to get into in this episode, to be honest with you, is the off the field stuff, primarily linked to a podcast that was published today. It's the Pivot podcast. I have to be honest, I have never watched an episode before of this podcast, but I absolutely should. I must say, the guys themselves, the podcast hosts, were great. One of the guys in particular, I thought, like, really nailed some of the questions where, like, we wanted to go to, which was Ryan Clark. Ryan Clark, again, don't know a ton about him, to be honest with you, but yeah, he asked a lot of the questions that I would have liked to have asked Jazz on this show, to be honest with you. But frankly, the main summary here is like Jazz is ultra relaxed and open in that environment. You've got like other black athletes, former athletes, whatever it might be, that are asking Jazz, and there's a connection there. There's a knowledge, there's an understanding, and it's probably not the connection that maybe me and Jazz would have as a non-athlete white dude from the UK. So those guys probably got into the questions that I wanted to, and they got more out of it than I would have ever been able to achieve. No doubt about it. And boy, oh boy, it is box office, it is popcorn, you name it. It's fair to say a few people were torched in that episode. And for those that haven't watched it yet, what I'd say is, as you're listening to this, hit pause on Locked On Marlins right now. Just hit pause. Find another hour in your day, if you can, in the next couple, whatever it is, to make sure you go and watch the Pivot podcast Jazz Chisholm Jr. episode. You will not regret it. It covers such a wide range of topics, but it is really insightful in terms of what Jazz has been kind of facing into as a rookie, as a rookie that has the pressure on him, which is Derek Jeter basically handpicks him, executes the trade for Zach Gallen. People in the organization kind of know what Zach Gallen is already and can be. Cy Young caliber starting pitcher. But Derek Jeter pulls the trigger because he sees qualities in Jazz Chisholm Jr. that are MVP level, all-star level, Silver Slugger, Gold Glove, you name it, whatever awards we got in baseball. Derek Jeter can see that in Jazz Chisholm Jr., goes and gets him, and then obviously he joins the team in 2020 in the COVID year. And I was part of the Marlins media circuit at that point, so I got to, hear from Jazz. I was close to things, much closer than I am now. That's for sure in terms of the vibe of what was going on. And so, I'm not in the clubhouse clearly, and it was a virtual Zoom room. But nevertheless, hearing what Jazz was going through, not just in 2020, but in 21 and 22, and how it kind of built up to this players meeting, almost like pivot moment, to be honest, in 2022. And really the actual true pivot moment came when Skip Schumacher joined the organization. Skip Schumacher was the pivot moment for Jazz. Skip was the pivot moment, not just for Jazz, but for the Marlins. Whatever you think about Jazz, I'm going to talk about some of the things he said shortly, but whatever you think of him, what we should all truly acknowledge is the value that Skip Schumacher directly has brought to this organization. He was manager of the year last year, and for good reason. Skip Schumacher righted this ship, changed the culture, and created a winning product in the space of a few months' time. And for that, as Marlins fans, we should never take that for granted, just how good Skip Schumacher is. And he's doubled down, to be honest with you. And Jazz kind of speaks about it in this podcast as well, but he's doubled down. Like, he's asking more from Jazz. And Jazz is saying, yeah, I'm all in, Skip. Equally, give me the guys, surround me with the guys that will buy into this too. What have we seen? We've seen Nick Gordon arrive, Jazz's best buddy. We've seen Tim Anderson arrive, another one of Jazz's buddies. We've seen Luis Arias join last offseason. Him and Jazz straight away vibing. Berger, Bell, vibing. It's almost like Jazz is like the culture secretary here. He's getting sign off on who's going to be a good fit for this clubhouse. Anyway, tons to get into. Truly astounding podcast. And I tip my caps to the guys hosting that podcast, the Pivot Podcast, because they created an environment here for Jazz to be comfortable to get into some of these really thorny topics. And some of them are truly, truly thorny and explosive. Anyway, let's get into the ads. I want to talk about some of the main takeaways from this podcast for sure. It's been a lot of fun. So this episode is brought to you by our good friends over at PrizePicks. Yes, sir. And we'll get some graphics pumped as well. There we go. Got the graphics in. So PrizePicks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. And it's the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS. It's just you against the numbers. Instead of battling thousands of other players, including pros and sharks, you pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in, baby. Football season may be over, but the action on the floor is heating up. Whether it's tournament season or the fight for playoff home court, there's no shortage of high-stakes basketball moments this time of the year. Get in on the excitement with PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app, where you can turn your hoops knowledge into serious cash. And you can now win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks. Yes, you heard that right. 100 times your dough on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into 1,000 with NBA, NHL, and college basketball entries today on PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. So what have you got to do? You got to download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. Reminder, the promo code LOCKEDONMLB for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. All right, guys, welcome back to Locked On Marlins with me, Peter Pratt. We are talking Jazz Chisholm Jr., guys. Yes, sir. Jazz is on fire on the field, and he has been scorching off the field. Not only on Twitter or X, he's back, baby. He's back on that platform, and he's kicking up a storm. But to be honest with you, we are going to spend the rest of this episode talking about some of the main takeaways from his appearance on the Pivot podcast. Please go and check it out, guys. You have to check it out. To be honest with you, you have to check it out before you listen to what I'm going to share. Because I'm going to share some spoilers. And I don't want to do that. I don't want to spoil it for you because it's really worth listening to. Anyway, the main takeaways, and there are many of them. I want to start with just this clip, this section where Jazz is talking about the captain. And fundamentally, Jazz absolutely torches Miguel Rojas. His description here is he's not a good captain. He's not a good person. He's not even a good athlete. He's just here. Holy smokes, that is a full torching for Miggy Rowe from Jazz Chisholm Jr. It's fair to say that Miggy and Jazz, they didn't see eye to eye. The reason they didn't see eye to eye predominantly is Miggy Rowe is the de facto captain because he'd been there the longest because, well, the Marlins moved everyone that had value, and whoever was left, that's Miggy Rowe, who didn't have any value, really, he just stuck with the club. And, he gave it all for the organization, etc., etc. He absolutely did. And he was a great spokesperson, I would say, within the media, particularly in 2020 during a very tough period. But overall, by this point, Miggy had been there the longest. It was his clubhouse. There was a lot of Latin guys, Spanish-speaking guys in the clubhouse at this point. And you could feel that as a fan. You could see, there's a big segregation that was there on the bench. It was pretty obvious. There was kind of Miggy and the Latin crew. And then basically, Garrett Cooper and John Birdie sat over there scratching their nuts. That was basically it. With Jazz, I guess. Not scratching Jazz's nuts. But anyway, it's clear to see that there was, they didn't get on. The reason they didn't get on, seemingly, Jazz kind of calls it out. He's straight up into the big leagues. He has, he rocks up. He's got a ton. He calls it out. He says, I've just got a ton of gear with me. I rock up. I've got all these custom cleats, custom gloves, you name it. And someone piles in and basically cuts up all his gloves and his cleats and everything. And Jazz is fuming about this situation. I think he's describing Jesus Aguilar in that situation. I don't believe he's describing Miguel Rojas. To me, it feels like he's talking about Aggie, but it could be someone else. I don't know. Let me know what you think of that. I took it away as I think that's Aggie he's talking about. Because Aggie would seem like that type of dude that I'm a vet, I've been around, and it's, we got to just kind of dunk on the rookies. And so I'm going to cut up all Jazz's gear. That kind of feels like the type of thing that Aggie would do. Again, knowing the type of dude that Aggie was, seemed like a kind of bit of a joker, but maybe took it a bit too far. Nevertheless, Jazz describes his time straight away and with the Marlins in 2020, 21, 2022. 3 seasons with the Marlins. In those 3 seasons were the worst years of his life. He hated the clubhouse. He hated his teammates. He hated the culture. He basically did everything he could to avoid being with them. He would turn up early to get his practice in. And when everyone else turned up there, he'd go and sleep. Then the game would start, the game would end, and he'd get out of there. This is Jazz Chisholm Jr. This is the guy that Derek Jeter identifies as effectively the future face of the organization, the superstar. We're trading away a Cy Young dude, potential Cy Young dude, to go and get Jazz because we're going to build around him for the future. And you've got this guy then saying, I hate it here. He's basically describing the Alec Bohm moment in some ways, but this went on for 3 years. So it sounded toxic. It was toxic, seemingly. And it built up to this situation where actually Jazz was being gaslit, I think, by Miggy Rowe. Hey, Jazz, you're amazing. Keep doing what you're doing. And then Miggy Rowe sneaking around behind his back, whinging to Don Mattingly about things that Jazz is or isn't doing, or the clothes that he's wearing, or the shoes he's got on the plane, or whatever it might be. Don Mattingly then stands up and says, no, enough's enough. This isn't high school. You're supposed to be the captain, Miggy Rowe. You can't come crying to me about these things. Speak to Jazz. Be a man and speak to Jazz. And the reason he wouldn't do that, the reason he didn't want to do it is because he knew, this is what Jazz was saying, he'd stand up for himself. Miggy would know that if he tried to do that with Jazz and tried to pull it, it wasn't going to fly. Miggy knew that it would not work. So instead, he went whinging to Don Mattingly, looking for Don Mattingly to do his dirty work. And Don said, no, let's call this players meeting. Let's air it out. There's things flying around everywhere. And that effectively ended Miguel Rowe's tenure with the Marlins. At that point, the decision was made. Miggy's got to go. Skip Schumacher rolled in. Skip Schumacher sat down with Jazz, understood it all. What's happening? What's going on? Tell me, Jazz, what can we do better? How can we improve? How can we win? Jazz laid it out. Skip executed it. Got Miggy out of there. Jesus Aguilar out of there. Anthony Bass out of there. All these dudes that were a drain on the clubhouse culture that didn't create the culture. They had a culture, an old school culture of these are the rules. This is how you play the game. No fun, no swag. Play the game right. The game will look after you. Don't know how I feel about that. There's some truth in there, but it's about doing it right for certain. More to get into here on the Jazz Chisholm Jr. Podcast with the Pivot podcast. Anyway, the Jazz Chisholm Jr. joined. There's another specific bit about Jesus Aguilar that's very interesting. He also talks about salary arbitration, which I think is very interesting. He talks about his switch to center field, how he views himself defensively moving forwards. There's tons to get into here for the rest of this episode. Before we do that, though, this episode is also brought to you by our good friends over at Amazon Fire TV. Yes, sir. And Fire TV is your destination for sports, from live games to highlights to in-depth analysis. Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs, as well as the Fire TV stick that you can plug into your existing TV that provides access to millions of movies and TV episodes, as well as free and live TV. Whether it's opening weekend for baseball or the college basketball tournament, you're going to want to have a Fire TV. And Fire TV recently created Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. That includes all of us at Locked On and most of the big pro and college conferences as well. Fire TV channels let you dive into all the game analysis, highlights, and more to keep up to date in the latest of the world of sports. March Madness, NBA, MLB, and lots more, not to mention great news, entertainment, gaming, travel, and cooking videos. Check out Fire TV channels on Fire TV and Alexa devices. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should. Trust me on this. And to learn more, you visit amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. This episode is also brought to you by our really good friends over at FanDuel. And you can say goodbye to busted brackets because FanDuel lets you bet on every game of the tourney. Whether you're betting on a big upset or a one seed, it's time to go dancing on America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on point spreads, money lines. You can even pick who's going to win it all. Just visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and bet on college hoops until they cut down the nets. All right, guys, back here with me, Peter Pratt, on Tuesday, the 19th of March, and this is now officially known as Jazz Chisholm Jr. Day. It should be a public holiday next year in the Bahamas. Multi-home run day, a roasting on Twitter, and a podcast that effectively roasted everyone in the clubhouse in 2020, 2021, and 2022. Boy, oh boy, Jazz went scorched earth on Miguel Rojas. He also had plenty to say about Jesus Aguilar. I think he had a run-in with Jesus Aguilar for cutting up his gear. Well, Jazz went and just torched the whole of Jesus Aguilar's locker, it seems, off the back of that. There was a toxic culture in the Marlins clubhouse, and Jazz kept out of it, wanted nothing to do with it, seemingly. Big, a lot of friction between him and Jazz. And that point, Jazz was looking at it going, listen, you may be the captain because you've been here the longest, but at this point, you don't have any talent, and you need to stop kind of dunking on me. I'm the captain now, which is basically what Jazz is saying. Another really interesting part, just speaking about Jesus Aguilar, is the way Jazz was talking about how when Jazz was playing shortstop, particularly in the 2020 year, how he had a number of errors, and a significant number of them were down to throwing errors. And he got to a point where he felt that Jesus Aguilar wasn't doing enough at first base. He wasn't putting in the effort for him. He was putting in the effort for Miguel Rojas, giving it the full splits, the full package. But for Jazz, ball in the dirt, he maybe would get the out, maybe he wouldn't. That's Jazz's view, rightly or wrongly. He then said he moved over to second base, because Miggy was there, the captain was there at short, so okay. Moved Jazz to second, and he said, moving forwards, I'm going to make sure that he can't do any of that. No messing. Because if he messes and he tries to not make the play on purpose, it'll hit him in the lip. He was throwing headshots at Jesus Aguilar because it was the only way to make sure he would make the play. Boy, oh boy. Wild situations. It feels a touch overblown, that one, I'm not going to lie. But again, another interesting wrinkle. A topic that you guys know is extremely close to my heart is arbitration. And I, for one, hate this process, to be honest. I find it just a really poor part of the game, to be honest with you. And there's just an undercurrent to it that I don't like. So you know that, and I've talked about it on this pod many times. Jazz spoke about his first experience of arbitration, and what it described to me was Jazz firstly didn't fully prepare for it in a way. He didn't know what to expect, and he didn't prepare fully for what he then walked into. And what he walked into was an employee of the Marlins, or for the Marlins, someone representing the Marlins, not them themselves in the room. And effectively, it boiled down to, these are the good things that Jazz does, but he's not available enough. That's the knock. It's the knock on Jazz. Jazz walked into it thinking, okay, I know that, but listen, guys, the reason I haven't played for a good portion of the last season is because, well, I did the team thing. I did what was necessary for the team. I moved out to center field, and I got hurt at our home ballpark, stubbed my toe on exposed concrete that you guys left there. That's kind of in Jazz's head, but that didn't come out because the team weren't there. It wasn't a team. It was a representative. Jazz then said, I'm going to go. I've got no problem going back to arbitration. I'm going to shoot for my number next year. If I don't get it, I'm going back in the arbitration room, and I'm going to feel very confident about the situation. And I think what he means by that is I know what to expect. And two, I'm expecting to have a monster year. I think Jazz is expecting a monster year, and he's going to sit in that arbitration room with a massive smile on his face, knowing that he's put up huge numbers with a huge amount of games played, and the Marlins will have nowhere to run. They will have to pay Jazz a fraction of what he's worth because, well, that's what arbitration is. And he gets paid way below his actual value and what he's produced. I thought that was really interesting, though. What it also says to me is, I think, future situation here of extensions with Jazz, considering Derek Jeter is no longer around, I think is a pipe dream, to be honest with you at this point. However, what I would say is, just on that topic, this is going to come down to, and this is why it's so interesting, how, Jazz and the way he views Skip Schumacher at this point, and the way that the culture is built around Jazz and the role they're asking him to play. Like if this becomes Jazz's team, and it is really at this point, that's basically what they're saying. Like, this is Jazz's team. We're building around him. I think that gets interesting. But, a lot of time can pass. There's multiple years left to go in terms of Jazz's control. And so, we'll see where we end up here with Jazz at the back end of this. We'll see what happens with Skip Schumacher. We'll see what happens with the organization and what the personnel looks like. Will Arias still be around? Nick Gordon, Tim Anderson, Josh Bell? Probably not, to be honest with you. And so, there's going to be a lot of changes here for Jazz. What I would say is, though, it's clear to see how much Jazz values Skip Schumacher and the culture that he creates. For Jazz's perspective, man, oh man, I mean, would you ever want to go back to the clubhouse he described? In the first few years, you go into that clubhouse where it's just like the old vets world. No, you want to play where you're happy. And for once, Jazz feels like he's in a good spot. So good on him. I'm glad he's feeling relaxed. I'm glad he's feeling a little bit more grown up about things. He's taken time to mature. I think the Derek Jeter connection is very, very interesting. The way that Jazz dealt with with Kobe Bryant dying in the helicopter crash, and how he then reached out to Derek Jeter saying, I need you to help me. I need you to help guide me. Jeter actually then, he did that. He took him under his wing. He tried to shape and mold Jazz, and Jazz kind of called it out that there's resistance to that. Jazz wasn't maybe mature enough to be able to handle that. So Jazz feels like he's in a great spot at 26 years of age now. He's been around the league a lot. He's seen veterans, probably good ones and bad ones, and what they can do. And so I think, like, from Jazz's perspective, there's things that, there's bits he can take from a lot of experiences that he's had so far. And I think that can stand him in good stead because people are looking up the Jazz at this point. He's supposed to be the leader of this. He is the leader of this club. Him and Arias is where it starts. And that's, I'm talking on the field, but that's what's necessary for Jazz. And he talks about this too, where he wanted to go back to shortstop. He wanted to look after himself. Like after this arbitration situation, he's like, oh, okay, I get it. Fair enough. I know the deal now. I know the business side. Well, with that being said, I took one for the team last year. Well, how about I'm going to look after myself now? I want to get back into shortstop because I'm always see myself as a shortstop. The Marlins don't have a shortstop. I still want to play short. But then all of a sudden it's like, oh, hold on, Tim Anderson could join us. Okay, great. Let's get TA in and I'll keep in at center. So, man, oh man, it was a wide-ranging podcast. For certain, Miggy Rowe got absolutely roasted in it, which will come as no surprise. Jesus Aguilar, fully roasted. The funny thing is, in this topic area, it feels like we've pieced the dots together regarding the players' meeting and what was happening in the clubhouse. But this is the first time that anyone of the players specifically have come out and said, this is what happened and this is why it happened. So I think it's really good that we finally got the truth of the situation. What I would say is if you did listen to an episode just about a year ago where with Danny Rodriguez, when he joined the episode, he actually spent a little bit of time sharing his insights and knowledge from his hashtag sources that he called it at the time, and pretty much nailed this on in terms of how Jazz described things in this episode. So Danny Rodriguez confirmed has sources. And it went down in that way. So I'm glad that we have that detail, that players meeting. It continued to be it would always be brought up, what happened, what actually happened. Naturally Miggy Rowe was trying to deflect because of course he was trying to deflect. Don Mattingly called the meeting because Miggy Rowe was gaslighting Jazz and bitching about him behind his back to Don. And Donnie was like, no, air it out, solve your stuff. All that happened was a bit of a slanging match, and the byproduct was pretty negative. Jazz just focused on himself, did what he did, and naturally the organization prioritized the better player, not the one who's been there the longest. That was, Miggy Rowe thought he held the power, but he didn't. He was just there the longest. And that was just a fact. He was the de facto captain because he'd been there the longest. But Jazz Chisholm Jr. had been identified by this organization. He'd put numbers up on the field, and it was pretty clear how the Marlins felt about Jazz. And when it came down to Miggy or Jazz, we know how it ended for certain. But boy, oh boy, roasting for him. Jazz loving on Skip, loving on the culture. For me, again, going back to this, right at the start of this, the thing that stands out to me is we should not take Skip Schumacher for granted. We should not. He has been so impressive so far, and he's a massive part of this. So's Jazz. Jazz a massive part of the Marlins. We saw it on the field today. We've seen it on the field the last couple of days. If Jazz is firing, this team's got a chance. If Jazz is on the field, he's probably firing. And if he's firing, the Marlins have got a chance. Arias is firing. He's always firing. There's no issues there. So for the Marlins to have success, they need Jazz. It was a terrible couple of years for him. He's described it anyway with the clubhouse, the culture. Those guys are gone. The clubhouse has it's come more towards what Jazz would have built, the types of dudes. Nick Gordon's there. Tim Anderson's there. Josh Bell's there. More black dudes, fundamentally. Different types of dudes in the clubhouse. Jazz describes it. There is no color in the clubhouse now. It's just a team. It's a unit. I've got to be honest, this is so encouraging to hear. So encouraging because clubhouse culture, vibes, you name it, they're critical. In a 1-6-2 for an absolute slogfest of a year where you're together all the time, there's always going to be people you don't get along with well, but you have to have a culture and a clubhouse that's moving in the same direction and can bring the best out of people. And we saw it in 2021, 2022. Things just fell apart. It got out of hand. It fell apart. And I get it. Miggy Rowe was trying to, drill in the rules, the old school. The way we treat rookies, all the old stuff, like don't be hot dogging, don't be showboating. He's out there trying to, get in Jesus Sanchez's head. That was another thing Jazz called out. The fact that those guys piled in on Jesus Sanchez because he was doing a mini Soto shuffle, pimped a bit of a homer, whatever it might be. Next thing is he's got no confidence. The guys, they were there trying to bring people down because that's what you do as vets. You're there to kind of bring people down, keep them grounded. For Jazz, there's no grounding Jazz. There will never be any grounding of Jazz. But where you tried that with Jazz, what you saw was a guy go into his shell, detach himself away from the organization, from his teammates. It just became a chore for him. And when your best player, and he is the best player, when your best player sees it as just a chore, you're not getting the best out of him. You identify your talent and you build everything around them to succeed. We've seen the same over and over and over again in many other sports, in many other situations, on many other clubs. You identify your studs, you build around them to ensure you get the best out of them. That's what the Marlins are doing with Jazz Chisholm Jr. Heading into 2024, healthy Jazz, he's expecting massive things. He's expecting to be in the arbitration room again, and he's expecting to do it with a massive smile on his face. That's been Locked On Marlins for Tuesday, the 19th of March, now formerly known as Jazz Chisholm Jr. Day. Look forward to seeing you guys real soon.